In 1967, the streets of Bristol looked ordinary. Buses ran their routes, shop doors opened and closed. People hurried to work, unaware that a moment was unfolding that would stretch far beyond that year, far beyond that decade, and far beyond the lifetimes of many who first heard about it. In 2025, those same streets still exist. The buildings have changed. The faces have changed. The world itself feels faster, louder, more connected. Yet a single thread ties these 2 years together, a thread pulled tight across 58 years of waiting. This is not a story about a mystery that vanished into history. It is the story of a case that refused to close. Some investigations end quickly. Some reach answers within days, weeks, or months. And then there are the rare few that linger, not because they are forgotten, but because they are unresolved. They remain unfinished sentences in the public record, questions written down, boxed up, and placed on shelves, waiting for a time when answers finally catch up. This case waited longer than a lifetime. For 58 years, it sat quietly in the background of British criminal history, not as a headline, not as a daily reminder, but as a file that never reached its final page. It was passed from one generation to the next, from one storage room to another, surviving office moves, policy changes, and entire careers. By the time it was solved, it had become one of the longest-running cold cases ever closed in the United Kingdom. And yet, for all that time, the question was never what happened. The question was when accountability would finally arrive. When the events of 1967 first unfolded, no one could have imagined how long the road ahead would be. Investigators worked with the tools available to them. They followed leads, conducted interviews, and preserved what they could. They did their work in good faith, believing that progress would come sooner rather than later. But progress did not arrive. Years passed, then decades. The world around the case moved forward, even as the case itself stood still. The people who worked on it retired. Some moved on to other assignments. Some carried the memory of the file with them long after they left the job. New investigators learned about it not through experience, but through training sessions and brief mentions in archives. It became a reference point, a reminder of how many questions can remain unanswered even with effort. And yet the case never disappeared. It did not fade into rumor or speculation. It remained documented, cataloged, stored. It existed in folders and evidence rooms, waiting patiently for a future that no one in 1967 could have described. This is what separates cases that vanish from cases that endure. Some fade because no one looks back. Others endure because someone, somewhere, refuses to let go. In this case, time did not erase the record. It simply added layers to it. Every year that passed added weight. Every decade added distance. By the time the calendar turned toward the 21st century, the case had already outlived many of the systems that first tried to solve it. And still, it waited. The idea of a case waiting may sound strange. Files do not think, evidence does not hope, but people do. And as long as there are people willing to reopen boxes, reread reports, and re-examine assumptions, a case is never truly done. This story begins with that waiting. It begins with the understanding that justice does not always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it pauses, sometimes it takes a long detour, and sometimes it moves so slowly that entire lifetimes pass before it reaches its destination. The year 1967 now feels distant. It belongs to a different era of policing, a different understanding of evidence, and a different relationship between science and investigation. What could be done then was limited by the tools of the time. What could not be done was simply left for the future, without knowing if that future would ever arrive. In 1967, evidence was collected carefully, but with no expectation that it would one day speak in new ways. No one imagined that material preserved then could later answer questions that resisted every attempt for decades. The case entered the system with urgency. It moved through the early stages with focus, and then, gradually, it slowed. Not because it was ignored, but because it reached the edge of what was possible. When a case reaches that edge, it does not end, it pauses, and that pause can last years or decades. By the time 2025 arrived, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed distant and abstract to those standing in Bristol in 1967. Technology had transformed daily life. Science had reshaped entire fields, and quietly, almost without announcement, the tools needed to answer long-standing questions had finally caught up. What had once been a silent file became readable again. What had once been preserved without certainty became evidence with a future. This is why, bear in mind, this case matters not just because of its outcome, but because of what it represents. It stands as proof that time alone does not decide whether a case will be solved. Effort does, preservation does, and patience does. Many cold cases exist. Few remain intact long enough to be resolved more than half a century later. This one did. The reason it stayed unresolved for 58 years is not a single failure, nor a single missed opportunity. It is the result of limits that once seemed immovable, limits that technology, slowly and methodically, learned to cross. For decades, the case sat in what some would later describe as a dusty box, not forgotten, but untouched, not abandoned, but waiting. Inside were reports written by hands long retired, notes typed on machines that no longer exist, evidence stored with care but without expectation. The box became a symbol of time itself. Each layer of dust represented another year without resolution, another year where the question remained unanswered, another year where accountability had not yet arrived. And still, the case remained open in spirit, if not in practice, because justice delayed is not justice erased. That distinction matters. It matters to investigators who understand that some answers cannot be rushed. It matters to institutions that preserve records for reasons not yet known. And it matters to the public who may never hear about the thousands of cases that quietly wait for science to catch up. This story is not about speed. It is about endurance. It is about what happens when patience outlasts time itself. As this documentary unfolds, we will move carefully between two worlds, the Bristol of 1967 and the Britain of 2025. We will trace how one moment echoed across nearly 60 decades. We will examine how evidence, once silent, finally found a voice. And we will explore what it means when accountability arrives long after most people would expect it. But for now, it begins here, with a city going about its day, with a file placed on a shelf, with a clock that kept moving even when answers did not. This is the case that refused to close. Before we continue with this chilling story, we would like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like resolved cold cases like this one. To understand why this case waited so long for an answer, you have to return to Bristol as it was in 1967. This was a city in transition. Post-war rebuilding was still shaping its streets, its housing, and its rhythms of daily life. Industry and commerce defined much of the working day. Neighborhoods were close-knit and routines were familiar. People recognized faces, they remembered names. There was a sense that what happened in one part of the city would eventually be known in another. Policing in the late 1960s reflected that world. Investigations relied heavily on observation, memory, and testimony. Officers walked beats. Detectives conducted interviews face-to-face. Notes were written by hand, then typed and filed away. Evidence was collected carefully, but within the limits of the science of the time. When the incident occurred in 1967, it sent a wave of concern through the community. News traveled quickly, but not instantly. There were no alerts pushed to mobile phones, no online forums, no digital archives accessible at the click of a button. Information moved through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and conversations between neighbors. The response was immediate in human terms. People talked, people worried, people looked twice at unfamiliar faces. For a time, the case was present in daily thought, even if details were incomplete. Investigators began their work as they always had. They secured the scene. They documented what they could see. They collected clothing and other materials believed to be relevant. They spoke with anyone who might have noticed something unusual. Every step followed established procedure, shaped by decades of experience and the standards of the era. What they did not have were the tools that would later redefine investigations. In 1967, forensic science was careful but limited. Blood typing existed, but it could only narrow possibilities, not confirm identities. Fibers could be compared visually, but not traced with precision. Records were stored on paper, often in filing cabinets that filled entire rooms. Cross-referencing across regions required phone calls, letters, and patience. Investigators worked with what they knew. They also worked with what they hoped would be enough. The victim survived the incident. That fact alone shaped the direction of the investigation. Officers gathered statements. They asked questions repeatedly, aware that memory can shift over time. They followed leads as they emerged, even when those leads led nowhere. They documented every step, believing that clarity would eventually follow persistence. But clarity did not arrive. As weeks turned into months, the pace of the case slowed. Leads were exhausted. Descriptions did not result in identification. The city returned gradually to its routines. The case remained open, but no longer dominated conversation. This is how many investigations enter a quieter phase, not with a decision to stop, but with the recognition that there is nowhere further to go. In the late 1960s, once available leads were followed, there was little more to do but preserve what had been gathered. Evidence was labeled, logged, and stored. Reports were compiled and placed in folders. Those folders were boxed, indexed, and shelved. No one imagined then that those materials would one day be examined with tools that did not yet exist. What mattered most was preservation. And that is where this case quietly distinguished itself. Despite the lack of progress, evidence was not discarded. It was not mishandled. It was stored according to the standards of the time, with care and intention. Clothing was kept. Documentation was maintained. The case file remained intact even as it aged. This was not unusual practice, but it was crucial, because preservation is an act of belief. It reflects the idea that answers may come later, even if they are not available now. The community response during those early years reflected both concern and uncertainty. People wanted resolution. They wanted reassurance. They wanted to know that what had happened would not happen again. But without new information, those desires had nowhere to settle. As time passed, attention shifted. New events filled the news. New priorities demanded resources. The case became one of many, remembered by some, unknown to others. For the investigators who worked it, the case did not vanish. It lingered in memory. It became a reference point, a reminder of unanswered questions. For the institution itself, the case became a record, a file, a box. And inside that box were pieces of information whose value would not be fully understood for decades. This gap between effort and outcome is not failure, it is reality. In 1967, there were things investigators simply could not do. They could not extract full genetic profiles from clothing. They could not search databases that spanned countries. They could not revisit evidence with new techniques every few years. They could only wait. And waiting, in this case, became the defining feature. The late 1960s did not offer closure. The 1970s did not either. As decades passed, the case moved further into history, carried forward by careful record-keeping rather than active investigation. Yet, the fact that the victim survived meant the case was never reduced to abstraction. It was always grounded in lived experience, in memory, in the knowledge that something unresolved remained. That unresolved state shaped how the case was remembered. It was neither solved nor forgotten. It existed in between. As forensic science began to advance in the late 20th century, the groundwork for future answers was quietly being laid. New techniques emerged, new ways of thinking about evidence took hold. But those changes took time to filter through systems built for another era. The case waded through all of it. What investigators in 1967 could do was limited by knowledge and technology. What they could not do would one day become possible. The difference between those two realities defines the long arc of this story. This chapter is not about failure. It is about context. It is about understanding that justice depends not only on effort, but on timing, that answers require tools, and that sometimes the most important work done in the early days of an investigation is not solving the case, but preserving it, because preservation keeps the door open. And in this case, that door remained open for 58 years. As Bristol continued to change, as policing evolved, and as science advanced, the materials from 1967 stayed where they were, quiet, unassuming, waiting for a future moment when they would matter again. That moment would not come quickly, but it would come. And when it did, it would transform a case defined by uncertainty into one defined by accountability. For now, though, the story remains in 1967, with a city moving forward, with investigators doing all they could, with evidence placed carefully into storage, and with time beginning its long, silent work.
There is a moment in every long-running investigation when activity slows, not because effort has stopped, but because possibility has narrowed. This is the moment when a case does not end, but changes state. For the Bristol investigation, that moment arrived gradually. In the months following the incident, detectives pursued every avenue that could reasonably be followed with the tools available to them. Individuals who came to attention were spoken to, sometimes more than once. Timelines were checked, movements were compared, accounts were weighed against one another. And then, one by one, early suspects were eliminated. Some had alibis that held. Some did not match descriptions consistently enough. Some simply led nowhere at all. This process was methodical, careful, and often frustrating. It relied heavily on human memory, which is powerful but imperfect. What someone recalls in the days after an event is not always what they recall months later. Details soften, certainty fades, confidence becomes conditional. Investigators understood this even then. They worked quickly when leads were fresh, knowing that time would change the reliability of recollection. But even speed could not compensate for the absence of physical proof that pointed clearly in one direction. The forensic evidence collected in 1967 had value, but only within strict limits. It could support or contradict certain claims. It could suggest possibilities. It could rule some things out. What it could not do was identify a specific individual with certainty. That limitation shaped the course of the investigation. As weeks became months, the lack of usable forensic leads became increasingly apparent. There was no definitive match to pursue, no technology capable of extracting deeper information from what had been preserved. The evidence could not speak beyond what it had already said. Investigators revisited materials anyway. They reviewed notes. They reread reports.
They reconsidered assumptions. This was not a dramatic process. It did not involve sudden revelations or turning points. It was quiet, repetitive work, driven by the hope that something overlooked might reveal itself with distance. Nothing did. Meanwhile, witness memory continued to change, as it always does. People who had been confident in their recollections began to express uncertainty. Time introduced doubt, not because anyone intended to obscure the truth, but because memory is shaped by repetition, conversation, and the passage of years. Details blurred. A figure seen briefly at a distance became harder to describe. A time remembered precisely became approximate. Certainty gave way to suggestion. Investigators documented these shifts carefully, aware that they were watching the natural limits of testimony unfold. Eventually, there came a point when no new information was emerging. No new witnesses stepped forward. No new leads surfaced. No new tools were available to apply. At that point, the investigation entered a formal pause. The case was not closed. That distinction matters. Closing a case implies resolution. Pausing a case implies waiting. Administratively, the file was marked inactive. This did not mean it was forgotten. It meant that there were no active steps left to take at that time. Resources were redirected to cases where action was possible. The Bristol file was organized carefully. Every report was placed in order. Every piece of evidence was logged. Every document was indexed. This was standard procedure, but it carried quiet significance. Because once a case enters this stage, its future depends entirely on how well its past has been preserved. The box was boxed, not discarded, not misplaced, boxed. The box was labeled, cataloged, stored. Over time, it joined countless others in storage facilities designed for memory rather than immediacy. Rows of shelves, uniform containers, a system built to hold history, not to display it. This is where the metaphor of the dusty box begins to take shape, not as neglect, but as stillness. A box that sits untouched is not empty. It is simply waiting for a reason to be opened again. As years passed into decades, the case moved further from the present. New generations of officers joined the force, having never heard of it. Training materials changed, procedures evolved, technology advanced in other areas, but the box remained. Occasionally, cases like this are revisited out of routine, a review, a check, a brief look to see if anything new might apply. In this instance, there was nothing to trigger such a return for many years. The absence of progress did not indicate a lack of care. It reflected the boundaries of the era. Cold cases are often misunderstood. They are not abandoned. They are suspended. They exist in a state of readiness dependent on developments that may or may not arrive. For decades, this case waited quietly, defined by what it did not have rather than what it did. It did not have a name to pursue. It did not have a match to follow. It did not have a method capable of extracting new meaning from old evidence. And yet, the evidence itself endured. Clothing remained sealed. Paper remained legible. Records remained traceable. This endurance is not accidental. It is the result of systems designed to think beyond the present moment, to assume that future tools might exist, even if current ones do not. As time moved forward, the concept of a cold case evolved. Advances in science began to change what investigators believed was possible. Techniques emerged that could analyze evidence in ways previously unimaginable. But change came slowly. The gap between innovation and application is often wide. Institutions adapt carefully. Protocols must be developed. Standards must be established. The Bristol case remained in its box through all of this, waiting. It is important to understand what waiting looks like in this context. It is not inactivity. It is potential held in reserve. The file did not disappear into obscurity because it was forgotten. It remained because it was preserved with the understanding that answers are not always immediate. For the people connected to the case, the waiting took different forms. For the victim, it meant living with the knowledge that accountability had not yet arrived. For investigators, it meant carrying an unresolved case in memory, even as careers progressed and eventually ended. For the institution, it meant maintaining a record that outlived the people who first created it. This longevity is rare, but it is essential, because when science finally caught up with the questions this case posed, the answers were not found in new events. They were found in old materials, in that box. The dusty box is not a symbol of neglect. It is a symbol of patience, of the understanding that some truths require time. As the years passed into decades, the case became one of many inactive files, but it never lost its integrity. Its contents remained intact, ready to be examined again under different conditions. That readiness would prove decisive, but at this stage of the story, none of that was visible. From the outside, the case appeared frozen in time. From the inside, it was preserved with intention. Cold cases do not end. They wait, and in this waiting, they carry the possibility of return. The Bristol case waited for 58 years, not because it lacked importance, but because the moment when its evidence could finally speak had not yet arrived. The box stayed on the shelf, dust settled, time passed, and history continued forward, unaware that an answer was already present, sealed away, waiting for the right moment to emerge.
Time does not announce itself when it passes through an investigation. It moves quietly. It moves through offices, through filing systems, through people. In the years after the Bristol case was marked inactive, the police station where the file was stored continued its daily work. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. New cases arrived, demanding immediate attention. Older cases moved further from the center of conversation. The officers who had worked the investigation in 1967 did not remain there forever. Careers progressed. Some transferred to other departments. Some moved to different cities. Some eventually retired. With each retirement, first-hand memory of the case became rarer. The story was no longer carried by people who had walked the streets of Bristol in those early days, asking questions and taking notes. It became carried by paper, by typed reports, by archived materials that spoke informal language, not personal recollection. This is one of the quiet realities of long-term cases. They outlive the people who began them. New generations of investigators entered the force with different training, different tools, and different priorities. They learned procedures shaped by decades of change. They learned how to work with computers, databases, and emerging forensic techniques. But the Bristol case was not part of their daily experience. It was not assigned. It was not discussed regularly. It was not taught as an example. It existed as institutional memory, a file that could be found if searched for, a record that could be referenced if needed, but not a case that demanded attention in the present. This transition from active pursuit to institutional memory is not unique. It happens to many unresolved cases. It reflects the practical limits of time and resources. Yet it also raises a deeper question. What happens when a case becomes older than the people responsible for it? In this instance, the answer is complex. On one level, the case became part of the system rather than part of a person's workload. It was cataloged, stored, and maintained according to policy. Its existence was acknowledged, even if its details were no longer familiar to most. On another level, the case continued to exist in the life of the person most directly affected.
The victim did not experience the case as a file or a box. She experienced it as time without resolution. Years passed. Life continued. Milestones arrived and moved on, but the unanswered questions remained. Living with an unresolved case does not mean thinking about it every day. It means carrying it quietly, knowing that something significant has never been fully addressed. As decades passed, the victim aged. The world around her changed dramatically. Technology advanced. Cities transformed. Social norms evolved. The case, however, remained rooted in 1967. It was defined by what had happened then and by what had not happened since. This contrast is one of the most difficult aspects of long-term investigations. The world moves forward. The case does not. For institutions, this creates a kind of historical layering. Files accumulate, systems adapt, storage expands. Older materials are moved further from daily access, not because they matter less, but because they belong to another time. The Bristol file became one of many that documented a moment now considered distant history. Yet unresolved cases carry a particular weight. They represent incomplete narratives. They stand as reminders that not every question is answered on schedule. Within policing, these cases serve as reference points. They remind investigators of the limits of certainty. They also remind them of the importance of preservation, because a case that outlives its investigators relies entirely on the care taken long ago. In this instance, that care was present. Despite changes in personnel, the file remained intact. It was not misplaced during relocations. It was not damaged during transitions. It survived reorganizations, renovations, and the gradual modernization of record-keeping. This survival was not dramatic, it was procedural, and it mattered. As the years turned into decades, the case became less about active pursuit and more about principle. It stood for the idea that unresolved cases still belong to the present, even if they originate in the past. This is why cold cases continue to matter, not because they promise immediate answers, but because they represent unfinished responsibility. For investigators who joined the force long after 1967, the Bristol case was not personal, it was historical. But history, within policing, is not separate from duty. It informs it. Every unresolved case reminds investigators that justice is not bound by timelines. The fact that a case is old does not make it irrelevant. It makes it challenging. The passage of time introduces obstacles that cannot be removed. Witnesses are no longer available. Memories cannot be refreshed. Some records are incomplete by modern standards. But time also introduces new possibilities. Advances occur. Methods improve. Questions once considered unanswerable become approachable. The Bristol case existed at the intersection of these two realities. For years, it sat quietly, defined by its age rather than its potential. But the potential was always there. It was contained within preserved evidence and carefully maintained records. It waited for a moment when those materials could be understood differently. This waiting period is often misunderstood as neglect. It is not. It is an acknowledgement of limits. Investigators cannot force answers when tools do not exist. They can only ensure that when tools arrive, the opportunity to use them remains. That is what happened here. As officers retired and new ones took their place, the case transitioned fully into the realm of institutional memory. It became something the institution remembered, even if individuals did not. This is one of the strengths of structured systems.
They allow responsibility to extend beyond individual lifespans. They ensure that cases can return even after long absence. For the victim, this meant living in a world that had moved on, while knowing that part of her own story had not. That experience is difficult to articulate. It is not constant distress. It is not daily expectation. It is a quiet awareness that something unresolved exists, an awareness that does not fade even as other aspects of life change. This is why unresolved cases matter decades later. They are not relics, they are responsibilities deferred. They remind us that justice is not defined by speed alone. It is defined by commitment. The Bristol case did not disappear when its investigators retired. It did not lose relevance as years passed. It became a test of whether systems designed to preserve memory could succeed, and they did. Because when the moment finally arrived to reopen the file, everything needed was still there. The reports, the evidence, the documentation. The case outlived its investigators, but it did not outlive its purpose. It remained, quietly, as a promise that some stories may take longer to finish, that some answers require patience measured not in months, but in generations, and that even when a file is left behind by time, it can still return to the present, waiting, ready, unresolved, but not forgotten.
For much of the 20th century, forensic science moved forward in careful, deliberate steps. Progress was steady, but incremental. Investigators learned how to compare fingerprints more reliably. They refined methods for documenting scenes. They improved ways of preserving physical materials. But identification remained limited. The idea that a single trace, preserved for decades, could one day point clearly to one person was not yet part of investigative reality. That began to change near the end of the century, and it changed everything. DNA analysis did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually through research, experimentation, and cautious adoption. Early applications were narrow. Samples needed to be large. Results were limited in scope. Databases were small. But even in its earliest form, DNA introduced a new way of thinking. It shifted investigations from probability to specificity. Instead of asking who might fit a description, investigators could begin asking whose genetic material was present. This shift transformed how evidence was understood. Items that once served only as contextual clues became potential carriers of identity. Clothing, in particular, gained new importance. Fabric absorbs, it holds, it preserves traces in ways that other materials do not. In 1967, no one collecting clothing evidence imagined this future. Officers followed procedure. They documented, sealed, and stored items because that was the right thing to do, not because they expected technology to unlock new information decades later. That act of routine professionalism would prove decisive. As forensic science advanced through the 1990s and into the 2000s, investigators began re-examining what older evidence might contain. Techniques improved, sensitivity increased, smaller and older samples became usable. What once seemed inert gained potential. Cold cases across the UK began to be reviewed through this new lens. This was not a single event, but a gradual shift in policy and practice. Law enforcement agencies recognized that advances in science had created opportunities to revisit unresolved cases. Dedicated units formed. Review initiatives were launched. Evidence stored for decades was reassessed, item by item. The guiding question was simple: what do we have now that we did not have before? For many cases, the answer was nothing. Evidence had been lost, materials had degraded, records were incomplete. But for some cases, the answer was significant. The Bristol file was one of them.
When the case came under review, investigators returned to the evidence with fresh perspective. They did not look at it as their predecessors had been forced to look at it. They looked at it with the full understanding of what modern forensic science could now offer. The victim's clothing was still intact, stored according to standards of the time, handled carefully, protected from unnecessary exposure. This fact alone set the case apart. Fabric is time-sensitive. Fabric can degrade, contaminants can accumulate, improper storage can render material unusable. But here, preservation had held. Investigators understood immediately what this meant. The clothing was no longer just documentation of an event, it was a potential source of identity. DNA technology had reached a point where even older items could be examined with precision. Advanced extraction methods allowed scientists to isolate genetic material that earlier generations could not detect. This process required care. Samples had to be handled delicately. Testing had to account for age and environmental exposure. Results had to be verified repeatedly. There was no guarantee of success, but there was possibility. UK cold case review initiatives existed for this exact reason. They recognized that time does not only erode evidence. In some cases, it preserves opportunity. As forensic science matured, so did the systems designed to apply it responsibly. Strict protocols governed how evidence could be re-examined. Ethical considerations guided decisions. Investigators were mindful that reopening a case carried emotional weight for those involved. This was not about revisiting the past for its own sake. It was about accountability. The Bristol case fit the criteria for renewed attention. It was serious, it was unresolved, and it contained preserved evidence that could now be examined in ways previously impossible. The review process did not begin with certainty. It began with questions. Could usable genetic material still be present? Would testing yield a complete profile or only fragments? Would any results have meaning without a reference point? These questions framed the work ahead. Forensic scientists approached the clothing methodically. They selected areas most likely to retain genetic traces. They followed protocols designed to minimize contamination. They worked slowly, aware that this was likely the only opportunity to extract meaningful information. This was not dramatic work. It took place in controlled environments, under bright lights, with careful documentation at every step. Science at this level is not fast, it is deliberate. Each stage required validation. Each result required confirmation. Nothing was assumed. When genetic material was successfully extracted, it represented a turning point, not a conclusion, a beginning. Because DNA alone does not solve the case, it must be compared. This is where the evolution of databases became critical. In 1967, no such systems existed. By the early 21st century, they had become central to modern policing. National databases allowed profiles to be compared across regions and time frames. Matches could be identified quickly or ruled out with confidence. For older cases, this capability was transformative. Evidence that once sat silently could now be asked a direct question: who does this belong to? The answer might be immediate, or it might take time. But for the first time in decades, the Bristol case was no longer defined by waiting. It was defined by action. Investigators understood the significance of this moment. They were not simply testing old evidence, they were bridging generations of work. They were connecting the careful preservation of 1967 with the analytical power of the present. This connection is often overlooked. Modern breakthroughs rely on past discipline. Without the decisions made decades earlier to store and protect evidence, no amount of scientific advancement would matter. This is why the intact condition of the clothing was so important. It represented continuity, a thread linking the past to the present. As testing progressed, investigators prepared for all possible outcomes. There might be no usable profile. There might be a partial profile. There might be a profile with no match.
Each possibility carried different implications, but all of them were preferable to permanent uncertainty, because action, even without resolution, affirms commitment. As results began to take shape, it became clear that something had changed fundamentally. The case was no longer hypothetical, it was measurable. It had data. This did not mean that answers were immediate, but it meant that the case had crossed a threshold, from historical record to active investigation, from preservation to application. The clothing, collected without expectation in 1967, had become the key to progress. No one involved in the original investigation could have imagined this outcome. They could not have predicted how science would evolve. They could not have foreseen the ability to extract identity from fabric decades later. What they did was follow procedure, and that was enough. As forensic science caught up with the questions this case posed, the stage was set for something that had not been possible for 58 years: accountability. The case was no longer waiting for time to pass. It was waiting for a comparison, for a name, for a connection between evidence and individual. That connection, when it came, would not belong solely to the present. It would belong to every moment of care that preserved the past, and it would change the meaning of a dusty box forever.
There comes a moment in every long-running case when history and the present finally meet. For the Bristol investigation, that moment arrived quietly, not with an announcement, not with certainty, but with a decision. A cold case team tasked with reviewing unresolved files returned to the archives. These were not detectives chasing leads on the streets. They were specialists trained to read history differently, to look at old cases through the lens of modern capability. They worked in silence, surrounded by shelves that held decades of unresolved questions, boxes labeled by year, folders marked by case number, records created by people who had long since left the profession. Among those materials was the Bristol file. It was not visually dramatic. It did not stand out. It looked like many others, but its contents told a different story. Inside were reports written with care, evidence logs maintained consistently, and most importantly, documentation confirming that key items, especially clothing, had been preserved intact. This is where the metaphor of the dusty box becomes real, because when the box was opened, it revealed more than paper. It revealed opportunity. The cold case team approached the file with restraint. Experience had taught them that reopening old cases requires balance. Hope must be tempered with realism. Many cases appear promising at first glance, only to stall when evidence proves unusable. This stage is where many investigations quietly end again. Evidence that looks preserved may no longer yield results. Materials may have degraded beyond recovery. Records may be incomplete. There are no guarantees. Still, the team made the decision to proceed. The reasoning was careful and deliberate. The evidence had been stored properly. The case was serious, and modern forensic methods had advanced far beyond what was once possible. The decision to re-examine the clothing was not taken lightly. Every time old evidence is handled, there is risk of contamination, risk of damage, risk of losing what little remains. Protocols were followed precisely. The clothing was retrieved from storage. Its condition was assessed. Environmental factors were reviewed. Nothing was rushed. This process is often misunderstood. It is not a single test. It is a sequence of steps designed to protect the integrity of the evidence. Forensic specialists examined the fabric carefully, identifying areas most likely to retain genetic material. They selected sampling points based on science, not assumption. This was work shaped by experience. Many similar cases reach this stage and do not progress further. The fabric yields nothing. The material has deteriorated. The results are inconclusive. These outcomes are common. They are accepted as part of the reality of cold case work. That is why expectations remained measured. The extraction attempt began. In controlled laboratory conditions, scientists applied techniques refined over decades, methods designed to recover even minute traces of genetic material. This was not dramatic. It required patience, precision, and repetition. The process involved isolating material, testing its viability,
and assessing whether it could produce a usable profile. Each step depended on the success of the one before it. Time passed. There were moments of uncertainty. Older evidence does not behave predictably under modern testing. Some samples respond, others do not. Sometimes partial results emerge only to fail verification. This is why so many cases stall here, but this one did not. Against the odds, the extraction succeeded. Not partially, not tentatively, but fully. A complete DNA profile was recovered. This outcome cannot be overstated. It represents the difference between possibility and action. A full profile means comparison is possible. It means databases can be searched. It means the case can move from theory to identification. For the cold case team, this moment marked a turning point. The dusty box was no longer a container of history. It was now a source of evidence. Still, caution remained essential. A DNA profile is not an answer by itself. It is a question. Who does this belong to? That question would now be asked of national databases. But before that could happen, verification was required. The profile was checked, rechecked, and confirmed. Chain of custody records were reviewed. Procedures were audited. Standards were upheld. This was not about speed. It was about certainty. Once confidence was established, the profile entered the next phase, comparison. At this stage, outcomes can vary widely. Sometimes a match appears quickly. Sometimes no match appears at all. Sometimes a partial connection suggests further inquiry. Each outcome requires different responses. The team prepared for all of them. They understood that even with a full profile, the case could still remain unresolved. Databases are only as comprehensive as the information within them. Not every individual is represented, yet the existence of the profile itself changed everything. For the first time since 1967, the case had a direct link to a person, not a description, not a recollection, but a biological identifier. This is what modern forensic science offers. It does not rely on memory. It does not fade with time. It does not interpret. It compares. As the profile was submitted, the team waited. This waiting was different from the waiting of previous decades. It was active. It was informed. It carried expectation, not resignation. Still, there was no celebration. Experienced investigators know that anticipation must remain contained. They have seen too many cases reach this point only to end without resolution. This stage demands patience. Days passed. Then weeks. The system worked as designed, comparing the profile against existing records. Each comparison either confirmed or excluded potential matches. Silence at this stage does not mean failure. It means process. The team continued their work, aware that whatever the outcome, the case had already crossed an important threshold. The dusty box had been opened, and once opened, it could never return to what it was, because even without a match, the extraction itself had proven that the evidence still had a voice. It had spoken after 58 years of silence. That alone mattered. But the story was not finished, because in this case, the comparison did not end in silence. It ended in recognition. A match emerged, not immediately, but clearly. The DNA profile corresponded to a man whose name had never appeared in the original investigation, a man who had lived his life beyond the shadow of the case, a man who was still alive. This development shifted the investigation from forensic analysis to accountability. It transformed the case from historical review to active enforcement. The implications were profound. Time had not erased responsibility. Age had not diminished relevance. The passage of decades had not protected identity. The dusty box, once a symbol of waiting, had become the mechanism of resolution. It connected the discipline of the past with the capability of the present, and in doing so, it proved something essential, that even after 58 years, a case can still move forward, that evidence, preserved without knowing its future value, still matters, and that patience, combined with progress, can finally bring a long silent story back into the light. The turning point had arrived. The case was no longer defined by time lost. It was defined by time reclaimed, and what followed would reshape how one of the longest-running cold cases in the UK would finally be remembered. By the time the DNA profile was ready for comparison, the investigation had already crossed a threshold that few cold cases ever reach. The evidence had spoken. What remained was to listen carefully. The profile was entered into national databases using established procedures. This step is both technical and procedural, governed by strict rules that exist to protect accuracy, privacy, and fairness. Each entry is logged, each comparison is controlled. Nothing is left to chance. The system began its work quietly. There were no flashing alerts, no instant confirmations, only a structured process unfolding as designed. Every profile in the database represents a record. Some are linked to previous investigations. Some exist because of unrelated matters. Others are there due to legal requirements introduced decades after the Bristol case first occurred. This is one of the defining realities of modern investigations. Today's tools interact with yesterday's decisions. As the comparisons progressed, the cold case team remained cautious. They had seen outcomes take many forms. Sometimes results appear quickly, sometimes they do not. Sometimes profiles match partially, prompting further analysis. Sometimes nothing returns at all. Time passed. Then, in late 2024, the system produced a result, a match. Not a partial alignment, not a statistical suggestion, a confirmed match. The name attached to the profile was Headley. The moment was handled with care. In cold case work, a name does not bring celebration, it brings responsibility. Every match must be verified independently. Procedures require secondary confirmation, cross-checking, and review by multiple professionals. The team followed those steps without exception. The profile was compared again. The data was validated. The chain of custody was re-examined. Each confirmation reinforced the same conclusion. The DNA recovered from clothing preserved since 1967 matched Headley. For investigators, this was a moment defined not by reaction, but by realization. The name had not appeared in the original investigation. It was not part of the early suspect lists. It was not a figure known to the case. This explained why the investigation had stalled decades earlier. The tools simply did not exist to make this connection. Another detail quickly emerged. Headley was still alive. At nearly 80 years old, he had lived his life without public association to the case. He had aged while the investigation remained dormant. He had experienced decades of change, unaware, or at least untouched by the evidence waiting in storage. This fact reframed everything. Cold cases often resolve after individuals have passed away. In those instances, resolution brings answers but not accountability. Here, accountability remained possible. Still, restraint guided every step. Age does not equal conclusion. A name does not equal guilt. A match does not replace due process. The investigation shifted carefully into its next phase. Detectives began building a contemporary understanding of Headley's life. This was not an effort to rewrite history, but to confirm timelines, locations, and potential connections. Records were reviewed. Public documents were examined. Everything was done methodically. At the same time, legal teams were consulted. Cases of this age require special attention. Evidence standards remain the same, but context matters. Memories have faded. Witnesses may no longer be available. Documentation must stand on its own. This is where the strength of forensic evidence becomes essential. DNA does not rely on memory. It does not change with time. It does not interpret. It either matches or it does not. The match to Headley provided a foundation strong enough to proceed. Even so, investigators did not rush. They understood the weight of what this meant, not only for the case, but for the victim who had carried unanswered questions for decades. The process moved forward quietly. Headley's age required careful handling. Procedures accounted for health considerations and legal safeguards. This was not about spectacle, it was about process. When law enforcement made contact, it was done according to protocol. There were no public announcements at that stage, no leaks, no statements, just steps taken one at a time. The shock within the investigative team was not emotional, it was contextual. Few cases remain unresolved for 58 years and then return with such clarity. Fewer still identify someone who can still be questioned under modern law. This was not about surprise, it was about rarity. For the victim, now decades older, the passage of time had shaped her life in ways the investigation never could. She had lived with uncertainty, with questions unanswered, with a story that had no ending. Now there was movement, not resolution yet, but direction. The importance of this stage cannot be overstated. It is where an investigation transitions from evidence to action, where the abstract becomes personal, where history intersects with the present. The name Headley anchored the case to a living reality. Investigators continued their work without commentary. They reviewed original reports once more, this time through a new lens. Details that once seemed isolated now aligned with modern understanding. Still, there was no rewriting of the past. The goal was clarity, not reinterpretation. Throughout this phase, discretion remained essential. Public confidence in justice depends on fairness, especially in cases that attract attention due to their age. The investigation proceeded within the boundaries of the law. By early 2025, the groundwork had been laid. The DNA match had been confirmed, supporting information had been reviewed, legal requirements had been met. Only then did the case move into the public phase. When the arrest occurred, it was done without ceremony. There were no public displays, no dramatic scenes, just the execution of a legal process that had waited nearly 60 decades to reach this point. The significance of Headley's age was acknowledged but not emphasized. Justice does not operate on timelines of convenience, it operates on evidence. For many observers, the question was immediate. How could someone live freely for decades while a case remained unresolved? The answer lies not in failure, but in limitation. In 1967, the investigative tools available could only reach so far. Officers did what they could with what they had. Evidence was preserved carefully, even without knowing its future value. That preservation made this moment possible. The decades between the attack and the arrest were not empty. They were filled with incremental progress in science, law, and procedure. Each advancement built toward the ability to answer questions once thought unreachable. This is why cold cases matter. They are not reminders of failure, they are records of patience. The revelation of Headley's name did not rewrite the past, it clarified it. It demonstrated that time does not erase evidence. It showed that responsibility does not expire, and it affirmed that unanswered questions can still find answers. For the investigation team, this phase required discipline. Media attention increased, public interest grew, yet the work continued behind closed doors, focused on preparation rather than reaction. Every statement had to be accurate, every claim had to be supported, every step had to withstand scrutiny, because the strength of a case is measured not by its age, but by its integrity. As the legal process moved forward, the narrative shifted once again. The case was no longer defined by what was missing, it was defined by what had been found. A name, a match, a connection made possible by patience and progress. Headley's life, lived beyond the reach of the original investigation, now intersected with a past that had waited for the right moment to speak. That moment had arrived. And as the case moved towards its conclusion, it carried with it a broader message, that even after 58 years, truth can still emerge, that evidence preserved with care can still serve justice, and that time, while powerful, is not final. The name from the past had returned, not as a rumor, not as a theory, but as a fact. And with that fact, one of the longest-running cold cases in the United Kingdom
entered its final chapter.
The arrest came quietly. There were no crowds, no raised voices, no sense of performance. In early 2025, nearly 58 years after the case first entered police records, officers followed a process shaped by modern law and careful restraint. The passage of time had changed many things, but it had not changed the fundamentals of accountability. A case does not dissolve because years have passed. It waits. When Headley was taken into custody, it was done in accordance with current legal standards. Officers were mindful of his age. Medical considerations were addressed. Legal rights were clearly explained. Every step reflected the balance required when history meets the present. This was not an arrest driven by urgency. It was an arrest guided by precision. The investigation had reached a point where action was no longer optional. The evidence, reviewed repeatedly and independently, supported the next step. Time had delayed this moment, but it had not weakened it. For investigators, this phase carried a unique responsibility. Arresting someone nearly 80 years old is not common. It demands clarity of purpose and confidence in the work that led there. There was no celebration among the officers involved, only acknowledgement. They understood that this moment represented decades of unanswered questions, preserved evidence, and scientific progress finally aligning. The legal process moved forward deliberately. Age does not exempt a person from legal responsibility. At the same time, age requires the justice system to proceed with care. Courts consider health, capacity, and fairness, but they do not dismiss cases solely because time has passed. This principle is foundational. If time alone could erase responsibility, justice would be uneven. Those who escape early scrutiny would be rewarded for delay. That is not how the system is designed to function. The case proceeded. Legal teams prepared arguments rooted in evidence rather than emotion. The DNA findings remained central. They did not rely on memory. They did not depend on testimony altered by decades. They stood on scientific analysis conducted under modern standards. This was crucial. Cold cases often face challenges because human recollection fades. Documents can be incomplete. Witnesses may no longer be available. In this case, the preserved clothing and the recovered DNA provided a form of continuity across time. It allowed the case to move forward without reconstructing every moment of the past. As news of the arrest became public, the reaction unfolded gradually. There was surprise, but it was measured. There was interest, but not disbelief. Many people expressed the same sentiment. They had assumed the case would never be resolved. That assumption had lived quietly for decades, reinforced by the absence of updates and the steady passage of years. The arrest disrupted that assumption. It reminded the public that unresolved cases do not disappear. They occupy shelves, databases, and records, waiting for the right conditions to return to the forefront. Media coverage reflected this shift. Rather than focusing on the individual, reporting centered on the timeline. Headlines emphasized the number of years. Articles revisited the idea of a dusty box, not as a symbol of neglect, but as a reminder of preservation. The box had remained closed, but it had never been discarded. Public discussion followed a similar pattern. People asked how such a case could remain unsolved for so long. Others asked why it was possible to solve it now. The answers pointed repeatedly to one factor: progress. In 1967, forensic science could not provide definitive connections across decades. Today, it can. That difference reshaped the outcome. For the victim, the arrest marked a moment that had once seemed unreachable. She had lived her life with a story that lacked resolution. The absence of answers had become part of her personal history. The case had existed alongside her, aging as she aged, remaining unresolved as the world changed around it. The arrest did not rewrite what she had experienced. It did not restore lost time, but it offered recognition. Recognition that the case mattered. Recognition that patience was not misplaced. Recognition that unanswered questions had not been forgotten. This distinction is important. Justice is not a promise of restoration. It is a commitment to acknowledgement and responsibility. The legal process that followed continued under public observation, but without spectacle. Proceedings focused on evidence, timelines, and procedural integrity. Each stage reflected the seriousness of handling a case with such historical weight. The courts recognized the uniqueness of the situation. A crime committed in 1967 exists within a very different legal and social context than one addressed in 2025. Yet the principles guiding accountability remain consistent. Evidence must be reliable. Rights must be respected. Conclusions must be supported. Throughout this period, there was a noticeable shift in how the case was discussed publicly. For decades, it had been described as unsolved. Now, it was described as resolved in motion. The language changed because the status changed. The case was no longer waiting. It was moving. This movement carried broader implications. Cold case units across the country referenced the investigation as an example of why evidence preservation matters. Training materials highlighted the importance of cataloging, storage, and documentation, even when immediate results are not possible. The Bristol case became part of a larger conversation about time and justice. It demonstrated that progress does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it arrives precisely when conditions allow it to be meaningful. The arrest also prompted reflection within law enforcement. Many of the original investigators were no longer alive. Others had retired long before DNA profiling became routine. Their work, however, laid the groundwork. By preserving evidence and documenting findings, they unknowingly contributed to a future resolution. This continuity matters. Justice is rarely the product of a single moment. It is the result of many decisions made over time. As public attention grew, so did awareness of similar cases. Families with unresolved questions saw renewed possibility. Investigators revisited files with fresh perspective. Not every case will reach this point. That reality remains. But the arrest reinforced an important truth. Effort is not wasted simply because results are delayed. The phrase, "justice does not expire," gained renewed relevance. It is easy to view time as a barrier. This case showed it can also be a bridge. Headley's age became a topic of discussion, but it did not overshadow the core issue. Responsibility does not diminish with age. It exists independent of how long someone has lived beyond the moment in question. The legal system recognizes this distinction carefully. Age informs how proceedings are conducted. It does not determine whether proceedings occur. As the case advanced, statements from officials emphasized restraint. They avoided dramatic language. They avoided speculation. They focused on facts. This approach maintained public confidence. It underscored that the goal was not reaction, but resolution. For the broader community, the arrest served as a reminder of the quiet persistence embedded in institutions tasked with safeguarding justice. Files may sit untouched for years, but they are not forgotten. They are preserved with the understanding that future tools may unlock their meaning. That understanding shaped this outcome. The dusty box had not been a symbol of neglect. It had been a symbol of patience. As the arrest phase concluded and the legal process continued, the case stood as a testament to the idea that time does not hold final authority over truth. It can delay, it can obscure, but it cannot erase. The accountability achieved after 58 years arrived with not drama. It arrived with confirmation. Confirmation that preservation matters. confirmation that progress changes possibilities, confirmation that justice, while delayed, can still arrive intact. And in that confirmation, the case moved beyond its long wait, not erased by time, not diminished by age, but carried forward at last into resolution.
There is a quiet truth about time. It can obscure, it can conceal, but it cannot erase. For the victim of the 1967 Bristol attack, the passage of 58 years was filled with uncertainty. Life carried on, shaped by absence rather than knowledge. Each day without resolution left questions unanswered, and yet, as decades passed, her resilience became part of the story itself. She had endured a lifetime of waiting without expectation, guided only by the faint hope that the truth might eventually emerge. The arrest of Headley did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not restore the time lost, nor did it rewrite the narrative of what she had experienced, but it changed the meaning of that time. The unanswered questions that had once hovered like shadows over her life were now met with clarity. The case, once dormant, had moved into a place where facts aligned with accountability. The waiting, long and arduous, had culminated in recognition. For investigators, the passage of decades presented its own complexities. Many of the original officers had retired, some had passed away, and institutional memory had absorbed the case in layers of documentation and process. Yet the work that had been done decades earlier, careful record-keeping, meticulous preservation of evidence, and the decisions made to archive the material became the very foundation that allowed modern science to speak. What once seemed like the end of a path turned out to be a bridge to resolution. The persistence of those who followed, combined with the advancements in technology, exemplified the principle that cases are not lost, they are delayed until the conditions are right to move them forward. Public trust in cold case work is fragile. When cases remain unresolved for years, sometimes decades, communities can feel that justice is beyond reach. Skepticism grows, and the memory of victims risks fading into anonymity. The resolution of this Bristol case, however, reaffirmed the value of patience and the power of science. It demonstrated that evidence, no matter how old, retains its voice. It reminded the public that investigations do not truly end when a file is placed in a box. They wait, they accumulate context, and they endure until they can be addressed effectively. The technological journey that made this possible is itself a story of progress. In 1967, forensic science was limited to the tools of the era: fingerprints, rudimentary chemical analyses, witness statements, and personal observations. DNA did not exist as a method of identification. Computers did not exist as a means to search massive databases of genetic material. Evidence collected was preserved with hope, but without understanding of its potential. Over decades, technology evolved. DNA profiling emerged, genealogical analysis became sophisticated, and national databases allowed for connections across time and geography. These advances did not erase history, they leveraged it. They allowed time to work in parallel with science, transforming historical records into actionable evidence. The Bristol case also serves as a benchmark for understanding other long unsolved investigations. In comparing this resolution to other cold cases, several lessons become clear. First, preservation matters. Evidence kept properly, even when its value is not yet realized, can one day provide definitive answers. Second, patience is critical. A case may appear to stall, but strategic review combined with emerging technologies can reopen possibilities that were once impossible. Third, accountability transcends time. Age, distance, and delay do not diminish the responsibility that justice requires. Evidence remembers. It is patient. It does not tire. It exists,
often quietly, waiting for the tools and understanding necessary to interpret it. Technology, in this sense, becomes the interpreter of history, able to reveal what has always existed but could not previously be accessed. Time hides details, buries records, and disperses witnesses, yet it cannot undo what has been preserved. It is the careful work of investigators, combined with scientific innovation, that allows these dormant truths to emerge. For the families affected and for the communities that witnessed the evolution of this case over decades, there is an important principle. Resolution does not always arrive quickly, but when it does, it carries profound significance. The moment the match was confirmed and the perpetrator was identified and arrested, it was more than a procedural success. It was a restoration of trust, a reaffirmation that dedication, precision, and scientific progress can align to bring closure, even after nearly 60 decades. This principle extends beyond any single case. Across the world, countless cold cases remain unresolved, files quietly waiting in archives, evidence preserved with the knowledge of its future utility. The Bristol resolution exemplifies why these cases matter. It demonstrates that what seems dormant may simply be waiting for the right convergence of expertise, technology, and diligence. The passage of time is not a final judgment, it is a context in which persistence, method, and innovation can operate to achieve justice. Reflecting on this case, one sees the interplay between human memory, institutional responsibility, and scientific advancement. Investigators in 1967 could only do what the era allowed. Those in subsequent decades built upon that foundation, often without immediate success. And finally, the team in 2025, armed with technologies that previous generations could not have imagined, transformed the dormant evidence into definitive proof. This chain of effort spanning generations illustrates the enduring nature of justice. It is neither fleeting nor easily dismissed. It persists until the necessary alignment occurs to give it voice. For the public, the story offers reassurance. It confirms that even in cases where decades pass and initial efforts appear insufficient, mechanisms exist to ensure that truth is not lost. The concept of the dusty box, once a metaphor for delayed justice, becomes instead a symbol of latent possibility. Preserved evidence, even when overlooked or forgotten, carries within it the capacity to change outcomes. In the end, the Bristol case teaches that time is both a challenge and a witness. It challenges by introducing distance, fading memories, and societal change. It witnesses by allowing preserved truths to endure until they can be understood. Technology, in this sense, becomes the interpreter of history, able to reveal what has always existed but could not previously be accessed. Time hides details, buries records, and disperses witnesses, yet it cannot undo what has been preserved. It is the careful work of investigators, combined with scientific innovation, that allows these dormant truths to emerge. For the families affected and for the communities that witnessed the evolution of this case over decades, there is an important principle. Resolution does not always arrive quickly, but when it does, it carries profound significance. The moment the match was confirmed and the perpetrator was identified and arrested, it was more than a procedural success. It was a restoration of trust, a reaffirmation that dedication, precision, and scientific progress can align to bring closure, even after nearly 60 decades. This principle extends beyond any single case. Across the world, countless cold cases remain unresolved, files quietly waiting in archives, evidence preserved with the knowledge of its future utility. The Bristol resolution exemplifies why these cases matter. It demonstrates that what seems dormant may simply be waiting for the right convergence of expertise, technology, and diligence. The passage of time is not a final judgment. It is a context in which persistence, method, and innovation can operate to achieve justice. Reflecting on this case, one sees the interplay between human memory, institutional responsibility, and scientific advancement. Investigators in 1967 could only do what the era allowed. Those in subsequent decades built upon that foundation, often without immediate success. And finally, the team in 2025, armed with technologies that previous generations could not have imagined, transformed the dormant evidence into definitive proof. This chain of effort spanning generations illustrates the enduring nature of justice. It is neither fleeting nor easily dismissed. It persists until the necessary alignment occurs to give it voice. For the public, the story offers reassurance. It confirms that even in cases where decades pass and initial efforts appear insufficient, mechanisms exist to ensure that truth is not lost. The concept of the dusty box, once a metaphor for delayed justice, becomes instead a symbol of latent possibility. Preserved evidence, even when overlooked or forgotten, carries within it the capacity to change outcomes. In the end, some stories do not end quickly. Some questions linger, not because they are forgotten, but because time and circumstance delay the answers. The 1967 Bristol case is one such story. For 58 years, the file rested quietly in a box, cataloged and preserved, its contents untouched by active investigation, yet silently waiting. The box itself became a symbol, though it was never meant to be. It represented the patience of evidence, the endurance of questions, and the persistence of those who preserved it without knowing the impact it might have decades later. It sat there as the world changed, as generations of investigators came and went, as technology evolved, and as society progressed. It waited until the right moment, when the tools, knowledge, and diligence could finally give it voice. When the box was opened in 2024 and the DNA evidence was analyzed, the quiet waiting transformed into action. A full profile was recovered from decades-old clothing. A match was made. A name emerged. Headley, nearly 80 years old, was connected to an event that had once seemed beyond resolution. What had been dormant for nearly 6 decades became clear in the light of careful work, scientific advancement, and unwavering attention to detail. Yet the significance of this breakthrough extends beyond the identification of an individual. It is a lesson in the persistence of justice. Time does not grant immunity. Delay does not erase accountability. The procedural steps, the preservation of evidence, and the steady advancement of forensic science together bridge gaps that once appeared insurmountable. For the victim, the decades-long wait did not end all consequences of the past, but it provided recognition. Recognition that her experience mattered. Recognition that unanswered questions could finally be met with facts. Recognition that the passage of time, while unavoidable, does not absolve responsibility. For investigators, it was a reminder that the work they do carries forward, sometimes beyond their tenure, sometimes beyond their own understanding. The careful documentation, the preservation of materials, and the structured approach to inquiry become tools for future generations to carry the truth to those who need it. And for the public, the case is proof that cold cases are not lost causes. They are records of patience, of methodical care, and of the eventual power of evidence. What was once hidden in a dusty box became a story of progress, demonstrating that resolution does not depend on the passage of time alone, but on human diligence, innovation, and integrity. This case, solved after 58 years, was not merely a legal closure. It was a testament, a reminder that some cases wait longer than lifetimes, that some answers arrive quietly, and that evidence, preserved and respected, remains steadfast even when human memory fades. In the end, The clock did not decide justice, people did. Investigators, scientists, archivists, and the legal system all played a role, and through their combined efforts, accountability, recognition, and truth reached across decades to arrive at the right moment. The box that sat untouched for decades no longer holds silence. Its contents have spoken. The case, once a story of waiting, has become a story of resolution, demonstrating that persistence and careful work can overcome the barriers of time. This was not just a solved case, it was a testament, a reminder that some cases wait longer than lifetimes, that some answers arrive quietly, and that evidence, preserved and respected, remains steadfast even when human memory fades. In the end, the clock did not decide justice, people did. Investigators, scientists, archivists, and the legal system all played a role, and through their combined efforts, accountability, recognition, and truth reached across decades to arrive at the right moment. The box that sat untouched for decades no longer holds silence. Its contents have spoken. The case, once a story of waiting, has become a story of resolution, demonstrating that persistence and careful work can overcome the barriers of time. This was not just a solved case, it was a testament, a reminder that some cases wait longer than lifetimes, that some answers arrive quietly, and that evidence, preserved and respected, remains steadfast even when human memory fades.